Chapter 3, Fluctuation in Meaning and the Ideality of Unities of Meaning. 24 Introduction. In our last chapter we dealt with the act of meaning. But among the conclusions of our first chapter was a distinction between the act of meaning, on the one hand, and meaning itself, on the other, the ideal unity as against the multiplicity of possible acts. This distinction, like the others which go along with it, the distinction between expressed content taken in a subjective, and the same taken in an objective sense, and, in the latter respect, the distinction between content as significatum and content as nominatum, are in countless cases undoubtedly clear. This holds of all expressions which occur in the context of an adequately expounded scientific theory. There are, however, cases where the situation is different, which require particular consideration if they are not to plunge all our hard-won distinctions back into confusion. Expressions whose meaning shifts, especially such as are occasional or vague, here raise serious problems. To solve these problems by distinguishing between shifting acts of meaning, on the one hand, and ideal units of meaning, on the other, is the theme of the present chapter. 25 Relations of coincidence among the contents of intimation and naming expressions may relate to the contemporary mental state of the person using them as much as they relate to other objects. They accordingly divide into those that also intimate what they name, or what they generally stand for, and those in whose case named and intimated contents fall asunder. Instances of the former class are interrogative, optative and imperative sentences, of the latter, statements relating to external things, to one's own past experiences, to mathematical relationships, etc. If someone utters the wish "I should like a glass of water," this serves to indicate to the hearer the speaker's wish, which is also the object of the statement. What is intimated and what is named here coincide in part. I say in part, since the intimation obviously goes further. It extends to the judgment expressed in the words "I should like," etc. The like naturally holds of statements about the ideas, judgments, and surmises of the speaker which are of the forms "I imagine that." I am of the opinion that. I judge that. I conjecture that. A case even of total coincidence seems at first sight possible, in, for example, the words "the state of mind intimated by the words I am now uttering," though the interpretation of our example breaks down on closer examination. But intimation and the state of affairs asserted fall quite apart in statements such as 2x2 equals 4. This statement does not say what is said by "I judge that 2x2 equals 4. They are not even equivalent statements, since the one can be true when the other is false. One must of course stress that if the notion of intimation is given the narrower sense defined above, the objects named in the above examples are not among the experiences they intimate. A man saying something about his contemporary mental state communicates its presence through a judgment. Only as intimating such a judgment, whose content is that he wishes, hopes, etc., this or that, is the manner perceived by the hearer as one who wishes, hopes, etc. The meaning of such a statement lies in this judgment, whereas the inner experiences in question are among the objects judged about. If we limit intimation in the narrower sense to experiences which carry an expression's meaning, the contents of intimation and naming remain as distinct here as they are generally. 26 Essentially occasional and objective expressions. The expressions which name the momentary content of intimation belong to a wider class of expressions whose meaning varies from case to case. This happens, however, in so peculiar a manner, that one hesitates to speak of equivocation in this case. The same words "I wish you luck" which express my wish, can serve countless other persons to express wishes having the same content. Not only do the wishes themselves differ from case to case, but the meanings of the wish utterances do so too. At one time a person A confronts a person B, at another time a person M confronts a person N. If a wish is B the same that M wishes N, the sense of the wish utterances, which includes the idea of the confronting persons, is plainly different. This ambiguity is, however, quite different from that of the word dog which at one time means a type of animal, and at another a foot or a grate. The class of ambiguous expressions illustrated by this last example are what one usually has in mind when one speaks of equivocation. Ambiguity in such cases does not tend to shake our faith in the ideality and objectivity of meanings. We are free, in fact, to limit our expression to a single meaning. The ideal unity of each of the differing meanings will not be affected by their attachment to a common designation. But how do things stand in the case of the other expressions? Can we there still stick to self-identical meaning unities, elsewhere made clear in their opposition to varying persons and their experiences, when here our meanings must vary with such persons and their experiences? Obviously we are here dealing with a case of unavoidable rather than chance ambiguity, one that cannot be removed from our language by an artificial device or convention. To promote clearness we shall define the following distinction between essentially subjective and occasional expressions, on the one hand, and objective expressions, on the other. For simplicity's sake we shall deal only with expressions in their normal use. We shall call an expression objective if it pins down, or can pin down, its meaning merely by its manifest, auditory pattern, and can be understood without necessarily directing one's attention to the person uttering it, or to the circumstances of the utterance. An objective expression may be in varying ways equivocal. It may stand in the stated relation to several meanings, so that it depends on the psychological context, on the chance drift of the hearer's thoughts, on the tenor of the talk already in progress and the tendencies it arouses, etc., which of these meanings it arouses and means. It may be that a glance at the speaker and his situation may help all this. But whether or not the word can be understood in one or other of such meanings does not depend on this glance as a sine qua non. On the other hand, we call an expression essentially subjective and occasional, or, more briefly, essentially occasional, if it belongs to a conceptually unified group of possible meanings, in whose case it is essential to orient actual meaning to the occasion, the speaker and the situation. Only by looking to the actual circumstances of utterance can one definite meaning out of all this mutually connected class be constituted for the hearer. Since we regularly understand such expressions in normal circumstances, the very idea of these circumstances, and of their regular relation to the expression, involves the presence of generally graspable, sufficiently reliable clues to guide the hearer to the meaning intended in the case in question. Among objective expressions we have, for example, all expressions in theory, expressions out of which the principles and theorems, the proofs and theories of the abstract sciences are made up. What, for example, a mathematical expression means, is not in the least affected by the circumstances of our actual use of it. We read and understand it without thinking of the speaker at all. The case is different with expressions which serve the practical needs of ordinary life and with expressions which, in the sciences, prepare the way for theoretical results. I mean by the latter expressions with which the investigator accompanies his own thought, or acquaints others with his considerations and endeavors, with his methodical preparations and his provisional beliefs. Every expression, in fact, that includes a personal pronoun lacks an objective sense. The word "I" names a different person from case to case, and does so by way of a never-altering meaning. What its meaning is at the moment, can be gleaned only from the living utterance and from the intuitive circumstances which surround it. If we read the word without knowing who wrote it, it is perhaps not meaningless, but is at least estranged from its normal sense. Certainly it strikes us differently from a wanton arabesque. We know it to be a word, and a word with which whoever is speaker designates himself. But the conceptual meaning thus evoked is not what the word "t" means, otherwise we could simply substitute for it the phrase "whatever speaker is designating himself." Such a substitution would lead to expressions not only unusual, but also divergent in sense. If, for example, instead of saying I am pleased I said whatever speaker is now designating himself is pleased. It is the universal semantic function of the word I to designate whoever is speaking, but the notion through which we express this function is not the notion immediately constitutive of its meaning. In solitary speech the meaning of I is essentially realized in the immediate idea of one's own personality, which is also the meaning of the word in communicative speech. Each man has his own I presentation, and with it his individual notion of I, and this is why the word's meaning differs from person to person. But since each person, in speaking of himself, says I, the word has the character of a universally operative indication of this fact. Through such indication the hearer achieves understanding of the meaning. He takes the person who confronts him intuitively, not merely as a speaker, but also as the immediate object of this speaker's speech. The word I has not itself directly the power to arouse the specific I presentation. This becomes fixed in the actual piece of talk. It does not work like the word lion, which can arouse the idea of a lion in and by itself. In its case, rather, an indicative function mediates, crying as it were, to the hearer your vis-a-vis intends himself. We must, however, add something to what has been said. Properly speaking, we should not suppose that the immediate presentation of the speaker sums up the entire meaning of the word I. The word is certainly not to be regarded as an equivocal expression, with meanings to be identified with all possible proper names of persons. Undoubtedly the idea of self-reference, as well as an implied pointing to the individual idea of the speaker, also belong, after a certain fashion, to the word's meaning. We shall have to admit that two meanings are here built upon one another in peculiar fashion. The one, relating to the word's general function, is so connected with the word that its indicative function can be exercised once something is actually presented. This indicative function is, in its turn, exercised / or the other, singular presentation, and, by subsumption, makes the latter's object known as what is here and now meant. The former meaning can be called the indicating meaning, the latter the meaning indicated. What is true of personal pronouns is of course also true of demonstratives. If someone says this, he does not directly arouse in the hearer the idea of what he means, but in the first place the idea or belief that he means something lying within his intuitive or thought horizon, something he wishes to point out to the hearer. In the concrete circumstances of speech, this thought is an adequate guide to what is really meant. This read in isolation likewise lacks its proper meaning, and is understood only to the extent that it arouses the notion of its demonstrative function, which we call its indicating meaning. In each case of normal use, its full, actual meaning can only grow out of the prominent presentation of the thing that it makes its object. We must grant, of course, that a demonstrative often works in a manner that can claim equivalence with an objective use. This in a mathematical context points to something determined in a conceptually fixed manner, that is understood as meant in this manner, without our needing to regard the actual utterance. A mathematical exposition, after expressly stating a proposition, may go on to say this follows from the fact that. Here the proposition in question could itself have been substituted for the word this without greatly altering the sense. This follows from the exposition's objective sense. One must of course attend to the continuous exposition since, not the intended meaning, but only the thought of an indication, belongs to the demonstrative considered by itself. Mediation by indicating meanings merely promotes brevity and increases mastery over the main drift of one's doubt intentions. The same plainly does not apply in the common case where the demonstrative this and similar forms stand for the house confronting the speaker, for the bird flying up before him, etc. Here individual intuition, varied from case to case, must do duty. It is not enough to look back to previously uttered objective thoughts. In the sphere of essentially occasional expressions one has also the subject's bound determinations here, there, above, below, now, yesterday, tomorrow, later, etc. Here, to think out a last example, designates the speaker's vaguely bounded spatial environment. To use the word is to refer to one's place on the basis of an intuitive, believing presentation of one's own person and location. This changes from case to case, and changes likewise from person to person, though each can say here. It is again the general function of the word to name the spatial environment of the speaker, so that the genuine meaning of the word is first constituted in the variable presentation of this place. The meaning of here is in part universal and conceptual, inasmuch as it always names a place as such, but to this universal element the direct place presentation attaches, varying from case to case. In the given circumstances of speech, it acquires heightened intelligibility by subsumption under the conceptual indicating presentation of here. An essentially indicating character naturally spreads to all expressions which include these and similar presentations as parts. This includes all the manifold speech forms where the speaker gives normal expression to something concerning himself, or which is thought of in relation to himself. All expressions for percepts, beliefs, doubts, wishes, fears, commands belong here, as well as all combinations involving the definite article, in which the latter relates to something individual and merely pinned down by class or property concepts. When we Germans speak of the Kaiser we of course mean the present German Kaiser. When we ask for the lamp in the evening, each man means his own. Note. Expressions with essentially occasional meaning, as dealt with in this section, do not fit into Paul's useful division of expressions into those of usual and those of occasional meaning. His division is based on the fact that the meaning which a word has in each application need not coincide with what usage accords in it in and for itself. H. Paul, Principien der Sprachgeschichte, p. 68. Paul has, however, included our essentially occasional expressions in his treatment, for he says, there are some words in occasional use which are essentially framed to designate the concrete, but which nonetheless lack their own relation to a definite concretum till individual application gives them one. Here belong personal pronouns, possessive and demonstrative adjectives, demonstrative adverbs, also words like now, today, yesterday. To it seems to me that occasional expressions in this sense fall outside of Paul's definitory antithesis. For it pertains to the usual sense of this class of expressions, that they owe their determinate meaning to the occasion, and are therefore occasional in a somewhat different sense. Expressions of usual meaning, in Paul's sense, can be divided into those usually univocal and those usually equivocal, and the latter into expressions usually varying among definite meanings assignable in advance, such as the casual equivoca cock, bear, etc., and those in which this is not so, since their meaning is oriented in each case to the individual instance, though the manner of this orientation is a matter of usage. 27 other sorts of fluctuating expressions. The variation of essentially occasional expressions is heightened by the incompleteness with which they often express the speaker's meaning. The distinction between essentially occasional and objective expressions cuts across many other distinctions standing for new forms of ambiguity. The distinctions, for example, between complete and incomplete, enthymematic, expressions, between expressions functioning normally and expressions functioning abnormally, between exact and vague expressions. The impersonalia of ordinary speech are good examples as to how apparently firm, objective expressions really vary subjectively in virtue of enthymematic abbreviation. No one would understand the sentence there are cakes as he understands the mathematical sentence there are regular solids. In the first case we do not mean that cakes exist absolutely and in general, but that there are cakes here and now, for coffee. It is raining, likewise, does not have the general meaning that rain is falling, but that it is doing so now, outside. What the expression lacks is not merely unspoken, it is not even expressly thought, it certainly belongs, however, to what our speech means. If additions are made, we plainly get expressions that must be called essentially occasional in the sense defined above. There is an even greater difference between the properly expressed content of speech, i.e. the content picked out and pinned down by the uniform meaning functions of the words involved, and its meaning on occasions when expressions are so shortened as not to express complete thoughts without the aids given to understanding by the fortuitous occasion, for example onward, you, man alive, but my dear etc. Through the common intuitive situation in which both speaker and hearer find themselves, these last can supplement or differentiate mutilated and subjectively indeterminate meanings. The defective expressions thus become understandable. Among the distinctions relating to ambiguity of expressions, we mentioned those between exact and vague expressions. Most expressions used in ordinary life, such as tree, shrub, animal, plant etc., are vague, whereas all expressions integral to pure theories and laws are exact. Vague expressions have no single meaning content, the same in all cases of their application. Their meaning is oriented towards types, only partially conceived with clearness and definiteness, types which tend to vary from case to case, perhaps even in a single train of thought. The types, stemming from what are, or from what seem to be, genuinely unified fields, yield a number of concepts, more or less cognate or related, which emerge in turn according to the circumstances of our talk and its varied thought promptings. These do not permit, for the most part, of definite identifications and distinctions such as might guard against unnoticed confusions among closely connected concepts. Similar to the haziness of such vague expressions, is the haziness of expressions standing for relatively simple genera and species of phenomenal properties, which shade continuously into one another, whether spatially, temporally, qualitatively or intensively. The typical characters which press in upon us in perception and experience, characters, for example, of space and time pattern, of color and tone pattern etc., lead to significant expressions which, in virtue of the fluid transitions among such types, i.e. among their higher genera, must themselves be fluid. Within certain ranges and limits their application is unhesitant, i.e. in fields where the type appears clearly, where it can be evidently identified and evidently distinguished from remotely unlike characters, for example signal red and coal black, and anti and presto. But these fields have vague borders, and flow over into correlative spheres comprehended in the same genus, and so give rise to transitional regions where application varies and is wholly uncertain. 328 Variations in meanings. As variations in the act of meaning we have become acquainted with various classes of expressions changeable in meaning, which count as subjective and occasional, since chance circumstances of speaking influence their change. To these expressions other expressions stand opposed, which are, in a correspondingly wide sense, objective and fixed, their meaning being normally free from all variation. If we take this freedom from all variation quite strictly, only exact expressions are ranged on this side, whereas vague expressions and expressions which, for differing reasons, vary with the occasion, stand ranged on the other side. We have now to consider whether these important facts of fluctuation of meaning are enough to shake our conception of meanings as ideal, i.e. rigorous, unities, or to restrict its generality significantly. Those ambiguous expressions we called essentially subjective, in particular, as also our distinction between vague and exact expressions, might make us doubtful on this point. Do meanings themselves divide into objective and subjective, into meanings fixed and meanings changeable on occasion? Must we, in other words, so interpret this difference, with seeming obviousness, that it becomes one between meanings that are ideal unities, on the one hand, fixed species untouched by the flux of our subjective picturing and thinking, and such, on the other hand, as live submerged in the flux of subjective mental experiences, and are transitory events, at one time there, and at the next moment not? We shall have to look on such a notion as invalid. The content meant by the subjective expression, with sense oriented to the occasion, is an ideal unit of meaning in precisely the same sense as the content of a fixed expression. This is shown by the fact that, ideally speaking, each subjective expression is replaceable by an objective expression which will preserve the identity of each momentary meaning intention. We shall have to concede that such replacement is not only impracticable, for reasons of complexity, but that it cannot in the vast majority of cases, be carried out at all, will, in fact, never be so capable. Clearly, in fact, to say that each subjective expression could be replaced by an objective expression, is no more than to assert the unbounded range of objective reason. Everything that is, can be known in itself. Its being is a being definite in content, and documented in such and such truths in themselves. What is, has its intrinsically definite properties and relations, and if it has natural, thing-like reality, then it has also its quite definite extension and position in space and time, its quite definite ways of persisting and changing. But what is objectively quite definite, must permit objective determination, and what permits objective determination, must, ideally speaking, permit expression through wholly determinate word meanings. To being in itself correspond truths in themselves, and, to these last, fixed, unambiguous assertions. Of course, to be able to say all this actually, would require, not merely the necessary number of well-distinguished verbal signs, but a corresponding number of expressions having precise meanings, in the strict sense of expressions. We must be able to build up all expressions covering all meanings entering into our theory, and to identify or distinguish such meanings with self-evidence. We are infinitely removed from this ideal. One need only think of the defective way in which we pin down time and space positions, our necessary recourse to relations to previously given individual existence, these last themselves inaccessible to an exact pinning down without making use of expressions having an essentially subjective sense. Strike out the essentially occasional expressions from one's language, try to describe any subjective experience in unambiguous, objectively fixed fashion, such an attempt is always plainly vain. Plainly therefore, considered as such, meanings do not differ essentially among themselves. Actual word meanings are variable, often changing in a single spell of thought, by their nature mainly adjusted to the occasion. Rightly seen, however, such change in meanings is really change in the act of meaning. In other words, the subjective acts which confer meaning on expressions are variable, and that not merely as individuals, but, more particularly, in respect of the specific characters in which their meaning consists. But the meanings themselves do not alter. This is in fact an absurd manner of speech if we adhere to our view of meanings as ideal unities, whether in the case of equivocal, subjectively defective expressions, or in the case of univocal, objectively fixed ones. This is not merely a view demanded by our ordinary orientation to fixed expressions, and by our talk of meanings which stay the same. Whenever anyone uses the same expression, it fits in with the whole guiding aim of our analyses. 29 Pure logic and ideal meanings. Pure logic, wherever it deals with concepts, judgments, and syllogisms, is exclusively concerned with the ideal unities that we here call meanings. If we take the trouble to detach the ideal essence of meanings from their psychological and grammatical connections, if we try, further, to clear up their a priori relations of adequacy, founded in this essence, to the objective correlates that they mean, we are already within the domain of pure logic. This is clear from the start if we first think of the position logic takes up to the many sciences, the position of nomological science, concerned with the ideal essence of science as such, or, what is the same, the position of nomological science, of scientific thought in general, taken purely in its theoretic content and connection. It is clear, secondly, when we know that the theoretic content of a science is no more than the meaning content of its theoretical statements, disembarrassed of all contingent thinkers and occasions of judgment, and that such statements are given unity by the theory's pattern, which in its turn acquires objective validity through the ideally guaranteed adequacy of its unified meaning to the objective correlate meant by it, which is given to us in self-evident knowledge. Undeniably what we call meaning in this sense covers only ideal unities, expressed through manifold expressions, and thought of in manifold act experiences, but nonetheless clearly separable from such chance expressions and from such chance experiences of thinking subjects. If all given theoretic unity is in essence a unity of meaning, and if logic is the science of theoretic unity in general, then logic evidently is the science of meanings as such, of their essential sorts and differences, as also of the ideal laws which rest purely on the latter. Among such essential differences we have those between meanings which have, and meanings which have no objects, between true and false meanings, and, among such laws, we have the pure laws of thought, which express the a priori connection between the categorial form of meanings and their objectivity or truth. This notion of logic as a science of meanings is of course at odds with the mode of speech and treatment of the traditional logic, which operates with psychological or psychologically slanted terms such as idea, judgment, affirmation, denial, presupposition, inference etc., and which thinks it is really only establishing differences of psychology and tracking down psychological laws relating to these. After the critical investigations of our prolegomena we can no more be taken in by all this. It only shows how far logic still is from a proper understanding of the objects which make up its own true field of research, and how much it has still to learn from the objective sciences, whose essence it nonetheless claims to make theoretically intelligible. Where the sciences unfold systematic theories, when they no longer merely communicate the progress of personal research and proof, but set forth the objectively unified, ripe fruit of known truth, there is absolutely no talk of judgments, ideas and other mental acts. The objective researcher of course defines his expressions. He says, by vis viva, by mass, by an integral, by a sign etc., this or that is meant. But he only points thereby to the objective meaning of his expressions, he indicates what contents he has in mind, which play their part as constitutive moments in the truths of his field. He is not interested in understanding, but in the concepts, which are for him ideal unities of meaning, and also in the truths, which themselves are made up out of such concepts. The investigator then propounds propositions, and naturally, in so doing, he asserts or judges. But he has no wish to speak of his own or of anyone else's judgments, but of the correlated states of affairs, and when his critical discussions concern propositions, he means by the latter the ideal meanings of statements. He does not say that judgments are true or false, but that propositions are so, his premises are propositions, and so are his conclusions. Propositions are not constructed out of mental acts of presentation or belief, when not constructed out of other propositions, they ultimately point back to concepts. Propositions are themselves the elements of inferences. Here too there is a distinction between acts of inferring and their unified contents, syllogisms, i.e. the self-identical meanings of certain complex statements. The relation of necessary consequence in which the form of an inference consists, is not an empirical psychological connection among judgments as experiences, but an ideal relation among possible statement meanings, among propositions. It exists or subsists, i.e. it is valid, and such validity is something without essential relation to an empirical thinker. If a natural scientist deduces a machine's working from the laws of the lever, gravitation etc., he no doubt experiences all sorts of subjective acts. What, however, he thinks of, and what he knits together in unity, are concepts and propositions together with their objective relations. An objective unity of meaning, i.e. one adequate to the objectivity which is self-evidently given, thereby corresponds to his subjective thought connections. This is whatever it is, whether anyone realizes this in thought or not. This holds in general. Though the scientific investigator may have no reason to draw express distinctions between words and symbols, on the one hand, and meaningful thought objects, on the other, he well knows that expressions are contingent, and that the thought, the ideally self-same meaning, is what is essential. He knows, too, that he does not make the objective validity of thoughts and thought connections, of concepts and truths, as if he were concerned with contingencies of his own or of the general human mind, but that he sees them, discovers them. He knows that their ideal being does not amount to a psychological being in the mind, the authentic objectivity of the true, and of the ideal in general, suspends all reality, including such as is subjective. If some scientists at times think differently on this point, they do so, not in their professional scientific settings, but on subsequent reflection. If, with Hume, we may hold that men's true beliefs are better documented by their deeds than by their words, then we may twit such thinkers with not understanding themselves. They pay no unprejudiced heed to what they think in their unreflective inquiries and demonstrations, but are led astray by the supposed authority of logic, with its psychologistic fallacies and subjectively distorted terminology. All theoretical science consists, in its objective content, of one homogeneous stuff. It is an ideal fabric of meanings. We can go even further and say that the whole, indefinitely complex web of meanings that we call the theoretical unity of science, falls under the very category that covers all its elements. It is itself a unity of meaning. If meaning, rather than the act of meaning, concept and proposition, rather than idea and judgment, are what is essential and germane in science, they are necessarily the general object of investigation in the science whose theme is the essence of science. Everything that is logical falls under the two correlated categories of meaning and object. If we speak in the plural of logical categories, we have only to do with the pure species distinguishable a priori within the genus of meaning, or with the correlated forms of categorially considered objectivity. In such categories the laws formulable in logic have their foundation. We have, on the one hand, such laws as abstract from the ideal relations between meaning intention and meaning fulfillment, and so from any possible knowledge use of meanings, and consider only how meanings can be compounded to form novel meanings, whether real or imaginary. For we have, on the other hand, logical laws, in the more emphatic sense, which consider meanings in respect of their having or not having objects, in respect of their truth or their falsity, their consistency or their absurdity, to the extent that such things are merely determined by the categorial form of such meanings. Corresponding with these latter laws, we have equivalent, correlated laws for objects in general, objects determined in thought by mere categories. All valid assertions regarding existence and truth, that are capable of being framed in abstraction from all material of knowledge on a mere foundation of meaning forms, find their place among such laws.